The cruelest part of this story isn't the fake marriage, it isn't the betrayal, it isn't even the gunman in the house. The cruelest part is that the whole world called them damaged goods. Him, a sterile mafia boss with no heir, her, a discarded waitress drowning in debt. And just when everyone thought their story was about survival only, fate pulled the most brutal twist of all. The woman he married to save his empire became the miracle that proved his empire was never dead at all.
In the shadowed heart of Chicago, power isn't measured in corpses, but in lineage. A king without a successor is merely a ghost on the throne, a placeholder for the inevitable bloodshed. For 3 years, Conrad Valletti has lived the slow death ever since a physician's verdict shattered his dynasty. An assassin's bargain had failed to take his life, but had stolen his legacy. The diagnosis was a quiet execution, absolute infertility. He commanded a billion-dollar kingdom of shadow and light, yet his name was destined to turn to dust with him. In his world, such a weakness was a fate crueler than any bullet. The sharks began to circle, whispers spread like poison. Conrad's time was running out. But destiny, it seems, has a twisted sense of poetry. And so, the universe brought him Reese Calloway, 27, working her life away at Serafina, a gilded cage he owned, and she was no one's fairy tale. Drowning under $280,000 of debt from her mother's last breaths, she endured the scorn of the city's elite each night. Her former lover, Grant Hartwell, had left her with a brand. Damaged goods. The city was grinding her to dust. Then Conrad Valletti walked through the doors, and where others saw a ruin, he saw something unbreakable forged in the wreckage, her only remaining asset. He wasn't searching for fragility. He was hunting for a soul that had faced oblivion and refused to kneel. This, then, is the story of a king undone by his own bloodline, and the forgotten waitress poised to shatter his reality. It's a tale of power, deception, an impossible pact, and a quiet miracle that would reshape an empire. If this story has found you in the dark, stay with me. Let us return to the night Conrad first laid eyes on his last hope. Conrad Valletti occupied the deepest shadow in Serafina, a table cloaked in darkness with his back to the wall. His sentinels guarded the door, near enough to kill but too distant to overhear. He required no menu. The restaurant was just another asset in his web of corporations. His slate-gray gaze was fixed, studying the waitress who absorbed the insults of the wealthy, yet served their meals with unnerving calm. Reese approached his cloistered table, her spine straight, notepad poised. A hint of sorrow lingered in her eyes, but her voice was winter itself. "Good evening. What can I get for you?" Conrad offered no pleasantries. He inclined his head, his stare a weapon that could break men. "Table 7, he stated, his tone low and sharp. It was not a query. The table belonging to Vera Ashton's circle, Reese's knuckles whitened on her pad. She knew precisely who he was. The unspoken law was absolute. Serve Conrad Valletti swiftly, silently, and never hold his gaze for more than 3 seconds. Reese met his eyes. "Yes, sir, I was. And no, I didn't cry. I don't have time for it. My shift is over at 11 with 14 tables left." "Now are you ordering?" A profound stillness settled over the table, and in that moment, Conrad saw past the defiant waitress. He saw the very thing he'd sought for 3 years, a soul that did not fear him. This was not naivety. It was the resilience forged by enduring horrors, far greater than a crime lord in the shadows. "A double espresso," Conrad commanded, a faint tremor at the edge of his lips. Not a smile, but an acknowledgement. Reese gave a curt nod and departed, unaware his gaze tracked her every move, catching the brief, hidden tremble of her hands in the kitchen's half-light. For precisely 3 seconds, her hands betrayed her before she inhaled control and returned to her duties. It was all the vulnerability she would permit. Conrad noted the fracture and the mending. He departed at 10:45, leaving $300 bills beneath his cup. From his car, he made a call. "I want a complete file," he commanded, his voice pure steel. "Reese Calloway, server 27. I want her debts, her home, her history, every thread of her life, by 7 in the morning." Yet by 3 a.m., the dossier lay on his desk. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. He dissected the pages in his darkened study. The subject? Reese Calloway, of Rockford, Illinois, a father lost at 11 in a factory accident that paid nothing. A mother who toiled for 13 years before stage 3 pancreatic cancer claimed her. Reese, a sophomore in college, abandoned her future to nurse her mother through the end. Her mother passed 2 years prior, bequeathing Reese a $280,000 burden. The report revealed no criminal ties, no influential allies, no allegiances. The conclusion was stark. She was utterly alone. Conrad closed the file. He sat in the gloom, a slow rhythm tapping against the mahogany. The final pieces were clicking into place. The asset was clean, resilient, unattached, and unafraid. At 6 in the morning, Conrad Valetti drove back to Serafina. He carried an offer he would not repeat. At 6:15 in the morning, Serafina was stripped of its magic. The intimate glow was replaced by the cold glare of fluorescent lights and the sharp scent of antiseptic. Reese Calloway was the lone soul within, cleaning tables. She arrived 45 minutes early for the extra $50 a week that stood between her and hunger. A lock turned in the back, a sharp sound in the quiet. Strange. The kitchen staff didn't arrive until 7. The manager wasn't due until past 8. Only employees and the owner used that entrance. Conrad Valetti materialized in the doorway, alone. A dark coat hung over his shirt, a scar visible at his shoulder. He was weary, yet his focus was absolute, his gaze as piercing as it had been hours before. Reese remained still, rag in hand, her expression unreadable. "We're closed," she stated, her voice flat. "I can make you an espresso, but the machine needs 20 minutes to heat." Conrad dismissed the gesture, maintaining a distance of 3 paces. His hands remained in his pockets, his stare erasing any illusion of a casual visit. "I'm not here for coffee, Miss Calloway. I have a proposition, and I value my time." Reese placed her rag on the table, her gaze unwavering. "Proceed," Conrad began, his delivery as cold and exact as a surgeon's scalpel. Each word was a strategic strike. He outlined the threat, his organization besieged by a Russian predator named Anton Jerkov. He explained his singular vulnerability, the absence of an heir. A 12-month clock was ticking. Failed to produce a successor, and his throne would be forfeit, his empire devoured. "I require a wife," Conrad stated, devoid of emotion. "This is a contract, not a courtship. I need an associate who will not falter before my rivals. The arrangement is this: a nominal marriage. You will reside in my home, playing the part of my wife for the council. In return, your $280,000 debt will be erased. Utterly." For 10 seconds, Reese said nothing, a silence more telling than any counteroffer. Her question, when it came, was sharp. "You are the king of this city's shadows. Why me?" His answer was as stark as her reality. because last night I observed you endure 20 minutes of humiliation, and you did not break. A person who can absorb that kind of pressure possesses a strength that cannot be purchased. But there is another term you must understand." He paused, a muscle twitching in his jaw near the old wound. It was a truth he hadn't spoken in 3 years. "I cannot father children. An attempt on my life left me sterile. The medical consensus is final. You would be binding yourself to the last of a bloodline. You must comprehend this before you answer." Reese simply observed him in the long, heavy silence. Her expression held neither pity nor fear. It was the quiet recognition of one fractured soul seeing another. "And if I accept," Reese said, her voice measured, "I enter your world." "You know precisely what that world entails," Conrad affirmed. "I cannot guarantee your safety, but I can promise you my respect. And I give you my word, within my domain, no one will ever label you damaged again." It was a vow of a kind she'd never known. Reese began to speak, but her gaze was drawn to the street beyond Seraphina's glass. And there he was, Grant Hartwell, strolling by with his new wife, a younger woman, blonde, draped in cashmere, a diamond on her hand, and the clear swell of a child on the way. Grant wore the placid smile of a man who had dodged a $280,000 bullet. He passed without a glance. His utter detachment confirmed it. Reese Calloway was a ghost. She turned her eyes back to Conrad. They were clear. Her jaw was firm. Her voice was ice, the sound of a woman choosing a battlefield over a slow, quiet death, Madel. "When do we begin?" she inquired. Conrad observed her for a final moment, the certainty in his gut solidifying. He had made the correct choice. 2:00 this afternoon, Chicago City Hall. A car will collect you at 1. You will require your identification. That is all." He moved toward the back, halting at the kitchen's entrance. "And Miss Calloway," he added, his back still to her, "that $300 from last night was not a gratuity. It was your severance." And with that, he was gone. Ree stood motionless in the vacant cafe, her knuckles pale against the tabletop, her breathing rapid and profound. She did not weep. Her face remained an expressionless mask. For 3 precise seconds she was utterly still, then her hands unclenched. She folded the cleaning cloth, set it on the counter, undid her apron, placed it on its hook, and departed from Seraphina for the final time. The event transpired at 2 that afternoon at City Hall. 5th floor, room 12, a minuscule office saturated with the smell of old paper and wax. There were no flowers, no attendees, merely 2 other men. Judge Raymond Kessler was present, sweating profusely, his terror of the man he owed a great debt to on full display. The other was Felix Valetti, Conrad's 28-year-old brother, propped against a wall with his arms folded, his face a stoic effigy. Punctually at 1 o'clock, a black sedan dispatched by Conrad retrieved Ree from her worn-down Southside apartment. She was dressed in the only non-work garment she possessed, a dated gray dress purchased at a thrift store for $12 3 years before. On her feet were the identical scuffed black flats she had worn for the past 2 years. She had made no effort with her looks. It was of no consequence. This was not a matrimony, it was an acquisition. Ree Calloway was accustomed to signing documents for predatory loans, for leases she was certain to violate, for debts she could never settle. This was just one more signature. The service concluded in fewer than 7 minutes. The judge's voice quivered as he recited the vows, his eyes flitting to Conrad as though for permission to breathe. When his moment came, Conrad uttered. I do, with the hollow, detached tone of a man finalizing a transaction. Ree reiterated the words, her own voice just as vacant but impeccably steady and clear. She signed the register with a resolute hand, placed the pen down, and never once looked at her new surname. Felix was silent through it all, but his sharp gaze never strayed from Ree. His eyes were the same gray as his brother's, yet colder, filled with a bitter alloy of contempt and suspicion. He observed her like a chess grandmaster contemplating a wild, unorthodox move. A card delivered them directly to the Velotti estate in Lincoln Park. Ree was without luggage. Her belongings were not worth the effort of packing. Her entire previous life was contained in a single canvas sack, which Conrad's men had already retrieved 2 hours prior, as if sterilizing a scene. The house was a 3-story limestone monolith from the 1920s, situated on a quiet road near the lake. From the exterior, it had the appearance of a cold, inanimate museum. The sensation persisted inside. A soaring ceiling and a crystal chandelier held sway over the entrance hall, but the atmosphere was still and frigid, like a forsaken cathedral. The marble floors gleamed like a black mirror, devoid of a single scuff, an errant shoe, or a discarded coat. It stood as a monument to wealth, a place for existence, not for living. The first individual she met was Margaret Byrne, the 55-year-old housekeeper. Her countenance was stern, yet her eyes harbored an unexpected warmth. She took Ree's hand between both of hers and murmured, "Welcome home," with a sincerity Ree instinctively trusted. Paige Valetti was the first of the 4 younger relatives she encountered. At 24, she possessed the family's dark hair and wore pearls with a modest dress, an odd juxtaposition of propriety and utter exhaustion. Ree perceived it in Paige immediately, a look she knew all too well, for she had seen it on her own face daily for the 2 years she cared for her dying mother. It is the expression of one bearing a burden far too great for their age, a muted cry for rescue. "Hello," Paige said, the words civil but carrying a slight continuous tremble that hinted at 1,000 unspeakable things. Tommy was not present. "Tommy's in the art room," Conrad stated, gesturing to the 3rd floor. "He maintains a considerable emotional distance." Ree filed away the information. Then the 16-year-old twins, Nina and Noah, offspring of a brother lost 5 years ago, materialized from a recreation room, moving like predators studying new prey that had stumbled into their territory. Nana's eyes raked over Ree, and her voice carried across the hall. "What unusual shoes. Did you find those at a bargain store?" A disdainful snort came from Noah beside her. Ree glanced down at her own battered shoes, then looked directly back at Nina. Her tone was flat, containing no hurt nor anger. "I did. And they have performed better than any $1,000 pair you likely possess." Nana was silenced for a beat, her smug expression wavering. It was then that Ree noticed it, for the first time, the slightest tilt of Conrad's head, the ghost of a smile he concealed from everyone else. That night, after Conrad had retreated to his 1st-floor office and a heavy quiet settled upon the mansion, Ree was heading to her room when a figure emerged from the stairwell obstructing her way. It was Felix Valletta, resting against the wall, his hands pushed deep into his pockets. The hallway light bisected his face, carving him from the shadows. He remained quiet, his gaze a cold, immense pressure, letting the silence itself become a form of intimidation. In this house, Ree deduced, silence was a weapon. "Listen to me," Felix finally spoke, his voice a low, measured growl. "I don't care what my brother believes he sees in you. It is irrelevant. I've witnessed dozens of people pass through this house. He paused. They all left. You are a contract, a signature on a page. Do not ever believe that makes you one of us. Reed did not retreat a single inch, though he loomed over her with the raw power of a man who settled disputes with his hands. She locked her gaze with his, and her reply was pure ice, with no trace of defiance, only a statement of dead calm fact. It was the unsettling stillness of someone who has been labeled as broken so often it no longer registers as pain. I am under no illusions, Felix. I know my role. I sign the papers and I do as I am instructed, so loathe me, watch me, test me however you wish, but I will be here tomorrow, and the day after that. She slid past him, her shoulder nearly grazing his, and continued straight to her room. She engaged the lock, leaned against the door, and only in that moment did her hands begin to tremble. But she did not cry. She had exhausted her tears long before she ever arrived at this place. The morning after her standoff with Felix, Ree was awake at 5 a.m., in a room that could have consumed her old apartment entirely. She stared at the ceiling for 30 seconds, then rose to perform the only task she understood. When her world descended into chaos, she imposed order upon it. This was not about dusting. The Valetti staff included Margaret Byrne and 2 others for that. Ree's objective was far grander. She was about to reboot the entire operational system of this broken home. On day 2, she entered the kitchen at 6 a.m. and discovered a commercial refrigerator filled with prepared meal containers. Each one was labeled Conrad, Felix, Paige, Tommy, Nina, Noah. The entire household operated on a separate menu. They all consumed their meals, solo, in various rooms, on separate schedules. 6 people under a single roof, behaving as complete strangers. Ree opens the refuse bin and, one by one, discarded every single meal. From the doorway, Margaret Byrne witnessed the entire act, and for the first time in a very long while, she smiled. In that first week, while she was clearing a pantry, an entire crate of glass jars fell and shattered on the stone floor. A sharp fragment of glass sliced deeply into her left foot. But Ree, an expert at ignoring pain, merely cleaned the wound, wrapped it securely, and did not mention it to a soul. That night she cooked dinner, not some complex Italian dish, but the kind of food her mother used to prepare in Rockford. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and a simple gravy. It was the type of food that permeates a house with an aroma that says, "Come and eat." She set the vast table in the main dining hall. This marked the first occasion in the 4 years since the Valetti matriarch was killed that the table was laid for more than one. She did not summon anyone. She just cooked, placed the dishes, and took her own seat. Paige was the first to appear. She stood in the doorway for almost 2 minutes, simply observing the table and Ree seated alone, before she finally entered and sat down without a word. Nina and Noah came for the food. Not the family atmosphere, but they came. They sat. They ate. And for the first time in years, the room was filled with the quiet music of forks against plates. Tommy was absent. Conrad was absent. Felix strode past the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the scene before he moved on without comment. But Ree saw it. His pace faltered for exactly 2 beats before he was gone. On day 3, day 4, and day 5, Ree cooked the same meal, set the same table, and sat in the same chair. She never implored anyone. She just created this small island of warmth and waited to see who would swim to it. Paige was the first to make landfall, and she remained. By the 4th day, she was not just there for a meal. She began to arrive in the kitchen early, watching Ree and asking questions in a very soft voice, as if she expected to be rebuffed. "Show me how to do the sauce," Paige asked. Ree's response was a simple gesture, the spoon offered without ceremony. "Watch," she said, her voice low, slowly, steady. In that silent kitchen, fragrant with melted butter and garlic, Paige's own story began to unfold. Not in a flood, but in fractured pieces from a life before it all shattered. My mother. She loved to cook. The smell, you miss it. The kitchen has felt so empty since she passed. Ree offered no embrace, no hollow words of comfort. She simply remained, working beside her, listening. She understood that some wounds don't need words. They need a silent witness to their suffering. Tommy was the house's greatest enigma. At 19, he was a phantom, a whisper who never spoke and haunted the third-floor art studio. Ree never knocked. She never summoned him down. Instead, she had Margaret Byrne place a warm meal on a tray outside his door each night, a napkin neatly folded beside it. The 5th morning, the plate was scraped clean. On the 7th day, a gift awaited her at the dining table. A delicate pencil drawing of a wildflower defiantly blooming through a crack in the concrete. It bore no signature, no message, yet Ree knew the artist's identity without question. She held the small sketch, studying it for a long beat before folding it gently and tucking it into her pocket where it would remain. The 9th day brought another image, a sparrow perched on a windowsill. The 12th, a sunset bleeding over Lake Michigan. Not a single sound had passed between them, but Tommy was communicating in a dialect of his own, and Ree was fluent, hearing every silent message. Na and Noah were a far simpler riddle. Ree refused to engage in their battles, meeting their adolescent assaults with a calm humor their drama could not penetrate. When Noah snatched her only shoes, his muffled giggles echoing from his hiding place, Ree simply padded into the kitchen barefoot to begin cooking. Her lack of reaction deflated his prank so thoroughly that he returned the shoes before dinner. When Na mocked her, "Your clothes are so cheap for the boss's wife," Ree merely replied, "A good dress doesn't know how to roast a chicken," as she served Na the best piece. The girl devoured it, her defiance silenced by her hunger. Felix, however, was a predator of another species. He was no child, but a 28-year-old man with blood on his hands, one who had watched his brother nearly bleed out 3 years prior, vowing no outsider would ever get close enough to inflict such pain again. He was engaged in a much deadlier game. A thorough investigation into her past was already underway, coursing through his clandestine network. He interrogated Margaret Byrne daily, probing for any sign of betrayal. A secret call, a visit to Conrad's office, an unauthorized meeting. His presence at dinner on the 6th evening was no truce. It was a reconnaissance mission. Throughout the meal, his gaze was that of a hunter, searching for any fracture in her facade. Ree registered his scrutiny. She understood Felix was waiting for a single mistake, one flicker of greed. Fear was not what she felt. Her soul-hidden truth was the growing collection of Tommy's drawings in her pocket. In the 3rd week, Conrad's business demanded a trip to Boston to meet an East Coast outfit, a display of power he could not afford to delegate. Absence would signal weakness, an invitation for his rivals to believe Conrad Validi was slipping. 3 days, he informed Felix before the car departed. 3 days. Secure the grounds. Isolate the family. No one in or out until my return. Felix gave a curt nod. Conrad's gaze then found Ree in the kitchen doorway, lingering for 2 heartbeats longer than usual. He entered the vehicle without a farewell. In their world, goodbyes were a luxury for men who expected to come home. The first day unfolded under a veneer of false tranquility. Ree prepared meals. Paige assisted her. Nat and Noah bickered over the television before eating together. At the table, Tommy left Ree another sketch, a cat dozing in a sliver of sun. Felix conducted his security patrols every 2 hours, his sweep of the cameras and gates punctuated by a cold, diagnostic stare each time he passed. On the second night, that fragile peace was obliterated. At 23:43, Ree was the lone soul awake at the kitchen table, tracing an old ledger to quiet her mind. The children were all asleep. Down below, in the chamber beside Conrad's study, Felix found his only solace in sleep with the cold comfort of steel beneath his pillow. For Ree, the first alarm was not a sound, but its complete absence. This was not peace, it was a vacuum, a heavy, lifeless stillness that choked the air. Her gaze snapped from the numbers on the page to the flickering security screen. The front gate's camera was caught in a digital whisper, a phantom loop playing out an identical sway of a branch. A guard trapped forever in a single moment, a ghost signal. The system was compromised. A silent scream built in Ree's throat, but she swallowed it down. While her heart hammered against her rib, her hands were a blur of trained instinct, moving without conscious command. She plunged the kitchen into darkness, snatched her phone, and dialed Felix. He answered on the first breath. Her words were a sharp, controlled whisper. "The gate is looping! We're compromised! Upstairs! Now!" Felix needed no explanation. He understood that the next 30 seconds separate the living from the dead. The thunder of his boots on the stairs became a war drum for Ree's silent advance into the main hall. An explosion of glass tore through the residence, a violent shockwave. The garden entrance was gone, utterly demolished. This was no amateur break-in. It was a surgical breach. Ree and Felix converged at the base of the staircase. In the faint light, she saw the firearm in his grip and his eyes, no longer assessing her, but scanning for enemies. "How many?" Felix demanded, his voice strained. "Unknown. We have no eyes, no cameras, no gate. Could be 3, could be an entire crew." An unnatural luminescence bloomed from the garden, trailed by the sharp grind of tactical boots on shattered glass. They were inside. The threat was in the house. Ree's head snapped upward toward the landing. "Paige!" she called, her voice a focused blade of sound intended for her ears alone. "Safe room! Take the twins! Go! Leave everything!" From the floor above came a frantic scramble, the groan of a door, and Na's drowsy question instantly silenced by Paige's sharp order. "Be quiet with me." They were making for the steel-reinforced sanctuary Conrad had installed. That chamber held 12 hours of air for 6 souls. The heavy thud of the steel bolt confirmed 3 children were safe, but 2 remained exposed. Tommy. His name struck her with physical force. He was on the 3rd floor, lost inside his studio, drowning out the world with music, completely unaware. Ree's gaze met Felix's, their history of mistrust evaporating into a grim equation. They were short one person. "Tommy's on 3, she stated. Felix moved for the stairs. "I've got him." "No!" Her hand shot out, her voice a shard of ice that stopped him cold. "Your mission is to defend this staircase. If they reach the 2nd floor, that door is our final defense. You have the only weapon. Hold this ground. No one passes. I am going for Tommy." Felix could only stare, and for the first time, his expression wasn't one of suspicion. It was something closer to fear. "Have you lost your mind?" he snarled. "They're armed." "So what? You have nothing to risk. I have Tommy," she retorted. Her tone shifted, taking on a primal, ferocious quality, a maternal instinct more resilient than any bullet. "Hold the stairs, Felix." She pivoted toward the gaping blackness of the third story, utterly defenseless, her bare feet making no sound on the wood as her heart pounded. From below, she heard Felix swear, followed by the crisp, metallic sound of a round sliding into the chamber. His weapon was now aimed at the encroaching shadows. The third floor was an abyss. They had severed the power with the cameras, leaving a long corridor illuminated only by a single slash of moonlight. Ree pressed on, an old injury in her foot sending sharp signals of pain up her leg with each step. Her steps were silent, not from stealth, but because a fever had inflamed her foot to the point where wearing shoes was unthinkable. Tommy's studio was at the corridor's end, the door slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness. Ree slipped inside, her vision slowly piercing the gloom. She saw him wedged into a corner, shielded by a wall of his own canvases. He clutched his sketchbook to his chest like armor, knees drawn in, his gaze fixed upon a horror visible only to him. Ree recognized that vacant look. He was not present. He was lost in a memory from 4 years back, the evening he witnessed his mother take 3 bullets. He had been just 15. The violence of tonight had hurled him back into that single, defining moment of terror. Tommy. Ree sank to her knees, making her presence smaller, her voice a gentle current against the storm inside him. Tommy listened. "It's Reese. I need you to get up for me now." Was her voice even reaching him? His gaze passed right through her. He was gripping the sketchbook with such force his knuckles shone white, his frame trembling with a recollection that no medicine could numb. And then she heard it. Footfalls, weighted, deliberate, ascending the staircase, not Felix. 2 shots had echoed from below. He was engaged in combat. It meant one intruder was occupied with him, while another had discovered an alternate path upward. The East Service stairs, she knew them instantly, a hidden path she'd learned in her first week. Then the footsteps outside fell silent. Ree rose, positioning herself between Tommy and the door. Her hand searched a nearby table, her fingers closing around a 6-inch steel palette knife, a simple painter's tool. It was a pathetic defense, almost a joke, yet it was all she had. For 27 years, Reese Calloway had fought battles with far less. The door blasted open. A massive silhouette in black consumed the frame, its face unseen, a silenced pistol aimed forward. The killer's eyes found Tommy, the objective, before snapping to Ree, the obstacle. He tilted his head, a moment of confusion passing over him at the sight of this woman in pajamas, armed with a tiny blade. But Ree was a statue, rooted to the spot, barefoot and defiant. She stared directly into the killer's eyes with a look that everyone in her life had always failed to comprehend. When she finally spoke, her voice was granite. "To reach him, you'll have to come through me." The assassin raised his firearm, and in that precise moment, a second shot thundered from the hallway behind him. Felix Velletti stood at the far end of the hall, breathing heavily, a fresh crimson stain blossoming on his left shoulder. Smoke curled from his weapon. His shot had been a fraction of a second faster. The assailant crumpled, his own gun clattering away. Felix moved forward, kicked the weapon out of reach, and confirmed the outcome while speaking into his phone. "Third floor is secure. I need backup immediately." Ree didn't look away. Her focus was entirely on Tommy. He was still in the corner, but his eyes were no longer vacant. He was seeing her, and on his tear-streaked, 19-year-old face was a look of pure, unbreakable trust. She knelt beside him, letting the useless knife fall, and pulled him close. Tommy's sketchbook hit the floor as he gripped her arm like a man going under. Silent sobs started to shake him, releasing the locked-away grief of a 15-year-old boy from a 19-year-old's body. In this house, no one had ever shown him it was safe to be vulnerable. Backup teams flooded the residence in 7 minutes. 12 minutes after that, Conrad's private cleanup crew took over, and the attacker's body was simply gone. No files, no trace. That was the world they lived in. In the hallway, Rhea and Felix rested against the wall, a few inches separating them. Tommy was now asleep in her lap, his breathing calm. Felix gazed into the distance, the blood on his shoulder like a grim badge of honor. He finally turned his head to her. For 2 weeks, he had studied her, dissected her every move, and dismissed her as a liability. That judgment was now gone, replaced by the profound respect one warrior gives another, for the barefoot woman prepared to die for his brother with nothing but a painting tool. "You could have fled," Felix said, his voice ragged. "This wasn't your contract. He isn't your blood." Reese looked down at the young man resting in her lap, her hand gently stroking his hair. Her reply was quiet but absolute. "You are mistaken, Felix. This place became my family the day I first stepped inside." Felix remained quiet for a long, heavy moment. Then, in a gesture that spoke volumes, he removed his black leather jacket, his armor, the one item she had never seen him without, and draped it across her shoulders.
In the world of the Mafia, such an act is more than kindness. It is a declaration. It is a warning to all. This one is mine. If you harm her, you will answer to me. Ree drew the jacket closer, absorbing his warmth. For the first time within these walls, a sense of safety washed over her. Conrad received Felix's call at 12:17 a.m. in a Boston hotel, and for 3 seconds his entire world went still. That briefest of pauses felt heavier than every piece of bad news he'd ever received. Because in those 3 seconds, he was lost in the hell of not knowing which of his family was still alive.
Felix delivered his report with the cold precision of a professional. A coordinated attack, 4 hostiles. The security detail was eliminated. The gate team was lost. Tommy was the objective, but the threat was now contained. 0 friendly casualties. Reinforcements were on site. That was everything Conrad needed to hear. He ended the call, was dressed in 40 seconds, and had the black Maserati screaming out of Boston at 123 miles per hour within 2 minutes. He raced west on Interstate 90, aimed straight for Chicago. A 6-hour burn. He made no stops for fuel, no stops for food. He just drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his focus absolute. A single thought echoed in his mind. Losing another soul from that house would utterly break him. 4 years ago, he had buried his mother. 3 years ago, he nearly followed her. He endured both. But on that dark ribbon of highway between Boston and Chicago, Conrad finally acknowledged that his circle of protection had expanded beyond Felix, Tommy, Paige, and the twins. Ree was now inside it. The waitress he had employed less than 3 weeks prior had just joined the short list of people for whom he would burn the world to ashes. He couldn't even say when the change happened. At 6:15 that morning, the Maserati glided to a stop at the Lincoln Park property. Conrad emerged into the sharp Chicago air, noting the sitting room's shattered door had already been professionally boarded over with plywood. There were no police cars, no yellow tape. nothing to suggest that just 10 hours earlier, this home had been a war zone. In Conrad Valetti's reality, all evidence of conflict vanishes before the sun rises. He entered not the silent emptiness Felix had described, but the quiet warmth of a house at rest. The main sitting room, where glass had shattered and bullets had likely flown, was now lit by the gentle glow of a crackling fire, and there, on the charcoal sofa, sat Ree, asleep in the corner, her head tilted at a delicate angle. Tommy was fast asleep on the same couch, his head resting in her lap, appearing more peaceful than Conrad had ever witnessed. Paige was curled up at the other end under some blankets, her hand gripping Tommy's shirt as if afraid he might vanish. On the floor beside them lay Tommy's sketchbook and a small paper knife. Conrad's gaze fixed on the tiny blade, questioning its purpose until a subtle movement caught his attention. It was Felix standing guard in a chair near the entrance, a pistol on his lap, the dark smudges under his eyes betraying a sleepless night. He rose as Conrad approached, and the two brothers shared a long, weighty silence. Felix then gave his debrief, his voice low and devoid of emotion, a clinical recount of the home invasion. He detailed everything. The moment the cameras went black, the jarring sound of breaking glass, and how Ree had moved a fraction of a second before he did. He told Conrad how she had commanded him to get Paige to the safe room to hold the staircase, and then charged up to the third floor alone, barefoot, into the total darkness. Felix paused, and when he resumed speaking, his tone had shifted entirely. This was no longer a report. It was a man trying to articulate the impossible. "She faced him with a letter opener," Felix murmured, his gaze not on Conrad but on the sleeping woman. The intruder had a silenced pistol. Her weapon was a paper knife, smaller than your little finger. She had to have known she was walking to her own demise. Do you understand? She knew, and she did not hesitate. Felix finally turned to his brother, and his eyes, which had held only suspicion for Ree for 2 weeks, now shone with a reverence Conrad had only ever seen him show to his own family. "She could have bolted, man. No one would have held it against her. She was only an employee." Felix swallowed, the sound thick. But she held her ground. Conrad did not respond. He walked past Felix, entered the sitting room, and came to a halt by the sofa. He simply stood there, watching Ree, his eyes locked on her hand, which, even in sleep, remained protectively on Tommy's hair, his gaze lowered to her bare feet, a stark reminder of her profound vulnerability the night before. He saw the heavy leather jacket, Felix's jacket, draped over her, and deep within his chest, a barrier he had constructed after his mother's death, a wall fortified the day he was told he could never have a son, began to fracture. Conrad sank to one knee beside the couch. The image of this powerful man kneeling was enough to stir Ree from her sleep. Her eyes flew open, meeting his instantly. Her entire body tensed, a warrior's instinct taking over as her gaze swept the room for dangers before returning to him. Conrad recognized that movement, the ingrained threat assessment that was second nature to him and Felix. That Ree had just done it unconsciously told him something within her had been irrevocably altered. It was no longer a choice, it was pure conditioning, a realization that struck him with a nauseating mix of pride and a deep, crushing sorrow. "You're not injured?" Conrad's voice was a flat monotone. His jaw, however, was set like stone, and his eyes were far from placid. They were cold, predatory, searching her for any sign of harm, any single bruise that would indicate she had been touched. "I'm fine," Ree rasped, her voice raw with fatigue. Conrad offered a slow, measured nod. His jaw tightened further, and his voice dropped to a register Felix called the point of no return. It was a tone where Conrad didn't get louder. He became so quiet the very air grew thin, and men held their breath just to hear him. You faced a gunman with a letter opener. You wore no armor. You possessed no real weapon. You ran barefoot toward certain death. The fury was a tempest, but it was directed entirely at himself, for his absence, for allowing her to fill a role that was his alone, for a debt he now owed that could never truly be settled. Ree met his intense gaze, offering no excuses, no justifications, and no defense. With a single sentence, her voice a hollowed-out whisper devoid of feeling, she gutted his rage. The contract was a farce by week 2, Conrad. He could only gape at her. As their eyes locked, the fortress Conrad had spent 3 years building, a prison of venom, of barrenness, of the fear of one more loss, crumbled into dust. And in the wreckage, he no longer saw a waitress or a hired bride. He saw the woman who would defend his family with nothing more than a letter opener. A wild thought took hold. She would never, ever be allowed to walk out of this house. Conrad faces his brother, spitting a single sharp syllable. Out. The door clicks shut. He pulls a chair to her bedside and does not move for 2 days. For 48 hours, the most dreaded man in Chicago's underbelly stood vigil over a waitress as a fever consumed her. He replaced the cool cloth on her forehead every 20 minutes, held her while she sipped water, and tallied every breath she drew. He counted them as he had for his mother 4 years prior, a watch that had ended in absolute failure. On the second night, near 3 a.m, the fever finally surrendered. Ree's eyes stirred open. The first thing she saw was Conrad. His hands knotted in the mattress as if she might drift away otherwise. Deep bruises of exhaustion were stamped beneath his eyes. A 2-day growth of stubble shadowed his jaw. His shirt was a road map of wrinkles. The billionaire crime lord looked like any other man, terrified of losing the one thing his fortune could never recover. Conrad rebreathed, her voice a faint thread of sound. His head shot up, and the wave of relief that crashed over his features was so potent it was almost violent. It was the expression of a man granted a pardon a heartbeat before the blade's fall. He leaned forward, his knuckles stark white against the sheets. When he finally spoke, the authority was stripped from his voice, replaced by the sound of a man who, in the long dark of his vigil, had finally conceded he could not survive losing her. You hid that injury for 3 weeks. A piece of glass nearly killed you, and you never said a word. Do you have any idea what that does to me? Ree simply observed him, her eyes clouded, but present. Angry. No, Conrad said, and the word just fractured. It was a small, clean break, but she heard it. She was seeing the impossible. Conrad Valetti was unraveling, not angry, terrified. I signed a contract for a business associate. I got someone whose absence would compel me to burn this entire city to ash. I love you, Ree. And that thought frightens me more than any bullet ever has. The room fell into a profound stillness. The only noise was the faint drip of the IV and the whisper of wind outside. Ree studied him for a long beat. Then, with a fragile, unsteady hand, she reached out to trace the scar that marked his jawline. Her touch was slow, deliberate, as if she were reading the violent history etched into his skin. Conrad remained perfectly still. To everyone else, Ree whispered, her voice clear despite its softness. I'm damaged, a liability, disposable. But here with you, I want to stay. Not for the money, not for $280,000, for you." Conrad's hand descended over hers, engulfing it as he leaned in, pressing his forehead against her own. He was so near Ree could count the silver flecks in his stubble. In that room, at 3 a.m, the business arrangement between the ruthless crime boss and the desperate waitress was officially terminated. In its place, something began to grow that no legal document could ever hope to bind. After the assault, Conrad Valetti's entire rhythm within his own home began to shift. It was not one grand gesture, but a series of quiet recalibrations. He began arriving home before 7 o'clock. Before, he was a specter until 10 at night, secluded in his study. Now, his presence filled the house much earlier. So then Conrad finally materializes for dinner, ending his self-imposed exile from his family. He remains utterly silent, eating Ree's food and just watching everyone. But his gaze keeps finding Ree's, as if she were an unsolvable equation he couldn't stop trying to decipher. The true shift, however, came with his brother Tommy. 2 weeks later, Conrad was passing the 3rd-floor art studio, a corridor he always avoided, but on this day, he actually paused. Tommy was lost in his own world, headphones on, when his brother Conrad broke the silence with the first real words that had passed between them since their mother's funeral. After a weighted pause, Tommy revealed the painting. It was their mother, suspended between shadow and light. The meaning was unmistakable. Conrad offered a single quiet nod of acknowledgement. And then Tommy, who had not spoken for 4 years, uttered a complete sentence to defend his new protector. Ree did not abandon me. The boy's allegiance was now pledged to Ree, the new guardian who had appeared after their mother was gone. Conrad said nothing, simply placing a hand on his brother's shoulder as they stood before the art for a full 20 minutes. The most profound dialogue they'd had in 4 years. 5 months later, Ree's public persona was completely reconstructed. The woman who entered the Palmer house was a stranger. The waitress had been erased. Her stark black dress was not an outfit, it was a statement. Her only ornament was a platinum ring, given by Conrad not from duty but from desire 2 months ago. The black heels, a gift from Paige, carried a confidence she had mastered in only a week of practice. Her hair was pulled back, revealing a jawline sharp enough to wound, and her eyes, once filled with ghosts, were now as cold and clear as a winter sky. To her right, Conrad's prominent facial scar wasn't a flaw. It was an emblem of his very essence. At Ree's left, Felix stood like a living rampart, an unspoken promise of protection the entire room could feel. Behind them, Paige, only 24, possessed the poise of someone who had spent a lifetime mediating conflicts between lethal men. And there they were, the Valetti family, a unified front appearing before the council for the first time in the 4 years since their matriarch was executed, a show of force more potent than any declaration. The meeting was held in a dark, oak-clad room at the Palmer house, the very space where generations of gangsters had drawn lines across the city. Only the clothes had changed, not the ritual of power. 14 men from 7 ruling families, the city's clandestine government, were present. This council was the true law, one built on intimidation and might. As Ree entered, her gaze swept the room and locked on Vera Ashton, a relic from her previous life, relegated to the wives section. Her judge husband, a mere pawn in this world. The words wither on Vera's lips the moment she sees Ree framed in the doorway. And for one drawn-out second, time itself holds its breath. A tremor seizes her hand, sending a champagne flute to its shattering end on the floor. the sharp crack of glass the only sound to pierce the void. Vera stares as if at an apparition, at the woman she once dismissed as living decor. Ree remains a statue of indifference, her eyes sweeping past this insignificant detail to land on the head of the table as she forces the tension from her jaw. Tucked away in a back row, Grant Hartwell sits beside a shadow named Antonov. Grant's suit is as immaculate as the day he labeled her damaged goods. The years, however, have not been kind. Shadows haunt his eyes, and stress has carved lines into his clenched jaw. In his gaze re-registers a new poison that was not there 5 months prior, a venomous cocktail of regret laced with raw envy. It is the expression of a man who now understands the worth of the treasure he set ablaze. She severs their connection in less than a heartbeat. She glided into the empty seat beside Conrad at the southern head of the table, claiming a position of power that had been vacant for 4 long years. The meeting began with the formal proceedings Conrad had prepared her for. After dull discussions of territory and revenue, Antonov Jerkov rose. His very presence seemed to leach the warmth from the air, casting an immediate chill. His speech was deliberate, his Russian accent a calculated menace, as he declared his intent to challenge the Valeti family for their seat on the council. Jerkov's strategy was a two-front war. First, he presented Conrad's lack of an heir as a profound weakness, painting the family's future as a threat to the stability of their entire organization. The second, more savage blow was delivered by Grant Hartwell. On cue, Grant distributed a folder to each member. In a flat, clinical voice, he detailed its contents, fabricated financial records designed to incite a federal investigation that would utterly ruin them. The proposal was not an offer of peace. It was an execution order. Jerkov would absorb all Valeti assets under a temporary guardianship. All eyes swiveled to Conrad, but he wasn't looking at the documents. His gaze was burning a hole through Grant Hartwell. Grant recognized that look. It was the same primal fear he'd felt after trespassing on Valeti land. Conrad's fury was a palpable force in the room, his hand tightening into a fist beneath the table as Felix's own hand drifted toward his weapon. Just as Conrad was about to detonate and ignite a war, a hand rested on his arm, gentle yet impossibly firm. Ree was looking directly at him. With a minute nod, she breathed a single command meant only for him. "Let me." For 3 silent heartbeats, the entire council watched, bewildered. Then the inconceivable occurred. Conrad yielded. The murderous tension bled from his shoulders, his fist uncurling. The council had just witnessed a bloodless coup. Conrad Valeti, a man who knelt for no one, had just ceded command to his wife. Ree stood, cloaked in a deliberate serenity that drew every gaze in the room. She moved from her seat to the heart of the table, stopping before the file that was, in essence, their death warrant. Her tone, devoid of any tremor, cut through the silence. "Council gentlemen, my name is Ree Valeti. I wish to review the papers Mr. Jerkov has presented." Anton Jerkov simply settled back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips, the very picture of a king amused by a commoner's audacity. "We are in a boardroom, Mrs. Valeti," Jerkov's voice dripped with contempt, twisting her name into a slur. "This is not a diner." A few of his men chuckled feebly. Grant Hartwell's eyes remained fixed on the table, his quiet a deafening admission of guilt. The two of them had made a lethal miscalculation, assuming the woman she was the woman she is. Ree allowed the jibe to wither in the tense air, then simply extended her hand, palm upturned. An unspoken, absolute command. Jerkov, certain of her ignorance, shrugged and slid the dossier toward her. She did not merely scan the documents. Her eyes consumed them, her focus sharpened by 2 years of finance at DePaul before her life had fractured. During the past 5 months within the Valetti estate, sleep was a luxury she'd traded for study. In the library's silence, she had dissected every financial paper available, titles, shelters, transactions. This was more than homework. It was a matter of survival. She was charting the very terrain of her new reality. In the world Conrad inhabited, currency was the native tongue, and she had become a master of it. Following 3 minutes of profound quiet, Ree concluded her assessment. Placing the dossier down, she tapped a single finger on page 17, her gaze finding and holding Yurkov's. Mr. Jerkov Ifreev. Her voice was a monotone blade. These 12 property movements are Section 1031 exchanges. This is a standard, legal tax deferment tactic employed by countless American investors annually. This is not some grand criminal plot. It's basic accounting. A palpable disquiet washed over the men present. Jerkov's features became a mask of stone. Ree continued, turning to page 23. The genuine crime, however, is detailed on this page. A lawful exchange requires documentation. Our family has the complete original records. Her finger pressed against the folder. In the copy Mr. Hartwell provided, each exhibit was methodically purged, not 1 or 2, all 12. That is no simple mistake, it is intentional fraud. The room was swallowed by a profound stillness. Grant Hartwell froze, the blood abandoning his face, leaving his skin with the pallor of wax. A lone bead of sweat on his brow was a silent scream of terror. His eyes met Ree's, but he no longer saw the server he'd dismissed as broken. He was facing the analyst who had just incinerated his betrayal. Incidentally, Ree added, her voice low and dangerous, divulging client information without a warrant is a violation of the Bank Secrecy Act. That particular error begins with a $500,000 penalty and a decade in a federal penitentiary. She allowed the threat to resonate in the quiet before producing a folded paper. The evidence, however, is here, a confirmation of a wire transfer from Jerkov Holdings to an offshore account in the Caymans. The owner of that account is Grant Arthur Hartwell, $250,000, transferred 3 weeks prior to today. Mr. Jerkov compensated Mr. Hartwell to falsify records and ruin the Valetti name. Should the council still wish to vote, I propose we first vote on forwarding this to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A complete and total silence descended. The 14 men around the table were motionless. Jerkov placed his hands palm down on the surface, a measured gesture that failed to conceal the fury clenching his jaw. His perception of Ree had been upended. Disdain was replaced by a frigid, tactical esteem. Grant Hartwell bolted upright, his chair screaming against the marble as a voiceless cry tore through him. The woman he had disparaged over a $280,000 debt had just engineered his utter ruin. He grabbed his briefcase and fled, the door latching behind him with the finality of a prison cell. From his chair, Felix Valetti, the man who had labeled Rhea a liability, shattered the stillness. His words were razors. For those of you who remain unclear, allow me to clarify. She is my brother's wife. Reaching her means dealing with me. Then Conrad rose. A man who spoke through deeds, his statement was physical. He placed a hand on Ree's waist, drawing her close in a display of unified strength. His slate blue gaze met Jerkov's not with rage, but with a far more lethal emotion. the absolute cold of ownership. She is my wife, a Valetti. Does anyone else care to dispute this? The council remained silent. The motion was finished. Within 10 minutes, Jerkoff had departed, uttering nothing more. And so Ree Calloway, formerly branded as broken, exited the Palmer House Hotel. Surrounded by Conrad, Felix, and Paige, her tale was already weaving itself into the city's criminal lore. In the months that followed, the Valettis did not just rebound, they launched an expansion unseen in 10 years. Ree became part of Conrad's core team, not merely as his spouse, but as a key tactician, reconstructing their wealth with the precision of a financier and the grit of one who had endured. Her plan gave even Conrad a moment's hesitation. A complete sanitization of their revenue streams, moving funds from illicit ventures into legitimate enterprises and acquiring real estate via cleansed shell corporations. This was not a question of ethics. It was a strategic pivot designed to move the Valetti name from the darkness into the light. A lawful enterprise would leave federal agents and the council with no power. Following a week of fierce discussion, Conrad's consent was terse. Proceed. It was her mandate. By June, for the first time in their history, their legitimate property earnings surpassed their criminal revenue. That July, Conrad secured new ground in southern Indiana, absent any violence. Legitimate capital proved a more potent tool than intimidation. The most profound shift, however, was in Felix. Previously an outsider, he was now an integral part, sharing morning's coffee with Ree at the kitchen island. Their discussions were brief and pointed, the clipped speech of two minds who despised triviality. He began to seek her counsel, initially on protection, then personnel, and ultimately on their overarching strategy. In a June meeting, when a subordinate challenged Ree, Felix silenced the man in less than 45 seconds, with a cold resolve that was never referenced again, yet was seared into the collective consciousness. He had evolved from Conrad's enforcer to the guardian of the new Valetti dynasty, with Ree as its indisputable matriarch. Early that same June, Paige submitted her application to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for fashion design. A 3-year-old ambition she'd suppressed when her family's life became a battle for existence. Ree was the one who discovered Paige's concealed sketchbook and championed her ambition, telling her, "Your talent is extraordinary." Ree also covered the tuition using a fund Conrad established for her. Funds she had never touched, as a life of scarcity had left her unable to indulge herself. Yet she knew precisely how to support Paige's future. Tommy's own resurgence was a silent wonder. He remained a phantom haunting his third-floor studio, but his work began to transform. Prior to Ree's arrival, his canvases were filled with somber hues and solitary, indistinct forms. His work transformed into the family's emotional chronicle. Somber paintings erupted with vibrant life, the kitchen's warm yellow, the hearth's deep crimson, the pale blue of the Chicago heavens. He began rendering figures instead of vague shapes. Paige's smile, Felix and his coffee, Nina and Noah bickering on the sofa. At the center of almost every canvas was Ree, the anchor in their storm. He slowly emerged from his isolation, joining them for dinner first 3 times a week, then 5, until it was daily. His voice came back, sparse but firm, mending a spirit broken by trauma. The 16-year-old twins, Na and Noah, transitioned from animosity to vying for the seat beside her. And Na, the young woman whose tongue was a blade, progressed from icy silence to speaking Ree's name, and at last to a single word that altered their world: sister. That small change in address held more significance than any corporate merger. A delicate tranquility descended upon the household, an equilibrium that lasted until August. It was a scent that shattered it. Ree, who had run on espresso since she was 18, the very engine of her will, was suddenly repulsed by it. Coffee, once her salvation, now sickened her. One morning, its fragrance sent her rushing to the bathroom. Initially, she dismissed it as fatigue from the 14-hour days she spent untangling their finances. She drank more water, altered her meals, but the illness persisted. The nausea returned on the third day. By day 5, the world tilted each time she rose. On the 7th, the scent of cooked meat drove her to the balcony for 10 minutes to fight for breath. An elemental terror began to take root, a particular horror familiar to any child who has seen a parent succumb to a lingering disease. Her thoughts turned to the assault, the wound in her foot, a latent infection, or even a subtle, slow-working poison. She concealed it, a reflex sharpened over 27 years of solitude. Her immediate impulse toward any vulnerability was to erase all traces of it. But Conrad Valetti was an expert observer of details. He noted the absence of her morning coffee. He observed her distance from the grill. He registered the slight narrowing of her eyes when she stood, a minute sign of her body battling vertigo. He perceived these signs because he had dedicated 5 months to learning her, to mapping her expressions until he could distinguish truth from artifice. And today, she was wearing a mask. It was an August evening when Conrad appeared in the kitchen doorway, his gaze fixed on Ree. He never wasted words. "What secret are you keeping?" Ree went rigid, her hands captive beneath the tap. "Nothing." "Your last nothing was a sepsis that nearly claimed your life." "I won't repeat myself, Ree." The silence was a blade. She cut the flow of water, placed a dish aside, and turned. And in her gaze, Conrad found a ghost he rarely encountered. Absolute terror. "Every morning I'm ill. Coffee's scent makes me retch. I feel faint. I don't understand it. But this is how my mother's illness began." Conrad erased the space between them, his hands seizing her shoulders. His eyes were cold iron, a look she recognized not as rage, but as dread, the kind a sovereign only reveals to his consort. "Tomorrow, 7 o'clock, we go to Northwestern Memorial, to Dr. Helen Ross, obstetrics and endocrinology, the city's finest. Not Stanton, not our usual physician, the absolute best." The word obstetrics was a mystery, but Ree was too weary to question it. With that tone from Conrad Valetti, obedience was the only path forward. Picture it. 7:12 is the morning, the 4th floor of Northwestern Memorial. Ree sits on the examination table, her anxiety a storm she tries to calm by watching the lake. Beside her, Conrad is a statue, his expression an unreadable mask. Yet his knuckles are bone white from gripping the chair. Ree sees through it all. Beneath that frigid composure, her husband is petrified. 8 months with him had taught her his silent language of fear. She understands that Conrad Valetti clenches his fist that way only when anticipating a fatal strike. Then, Dr. Helen Ross enters, holding their future in a file. At 52, with salt and pepper hair, she carries the authority of a 30-year veteran. Unimpressed by power or title, she takes a seat, reviews the chart, and offers a gaze that defies interpretation. It holds neither sympathy nor detachment. It is the look of a person about to shatter their reality. "Mrs. Valetti," the doctor begins, her tone professional. "Before we proceed, I have a question for your husband." She turns to Conrad. "Mr. Valetti, who diagnosed your permanent sterility?" The scar along Conrad's jawline tenses. Dr. Philip Stanton, our physician, 3 years ago following a poisoning. The results indicated irreversible damage. Dr. Ross gives a slow nod and sets down her pen. Her next words are quieter, carefully measured. Mr. Valetti, I have reviewed the complete file from your incident 3 years ago. The toxin, likely an industrial compound, inflicted severe trauma on your system. So Dr. Stanton's diagnosis at that time was technically correct. That single word lingers, stealing the air from Rhee's lungs. But the body has a profound capacity for recovery under new conditions. Improved nutrition, reduced anxiety, a sense of security. These things can mend what was once deemed irrevocably damaged. The conclusion from 3 years ago was a moment in time, not a permanent fate. Conrad shows no reaction, his body utterly still, his eyes fixed on the doctor. Rhee watches his knuckles press harder into the chair. He is bracing, conditioned by 3 years in which but was the herald of disaster. Then Dr. Ross faces Rhee, her expression softening into something like a smile. Mrs. Valetti, you are in perfect health. What you're experiencing is not an illness. You are pregnant, approximately 11 weeks along. And just like that, reality dissolved. The panorama of Lake Michigan vanishes. The fluorescent glare, the antiseptic scent, the low hum of equipment, it all fades to nothing. Her mind fixates on 2 words echoing in the void. Pregnant, 11 weeks. For the space of 5 heartbeats, Rhee is frozen. Then her palms press against her abdomen, discovering a new solidity there, a presence she now understands as life, not pathology. But Rhee manages, her sight clouding. They insisted it couldn't happen. For 3 years, they called it permanent. How? A knowing look crosses Dr. Ross's features. I've practiced medicine for 30 years, Mrs. Valetti. I have learned to never declare anything impossible for the human body, particularly when the will to heal is strong. Her eyes shifted to Conrad, still rigid as stone, before returning to Rhee. I'll leave you both for a moment. She rises, takes the chart, and exits, the latch clicking softly behind her. A heavy, absolute silence descends, broken only by the whisper of the pressure cuff and the sound of 2 people's breath. Rhee observes Conrad. He remains seated, his gaze lost in the middle distance. She studied the face of the man Chicago named a monster, who commanded $1 billion enterprise through sheer will. She had witnessed this man endure every assault the world offered without a flicker of weakness. But this was different. He was not breaking from pain, but from a revelation too vast for his mind to grasp. Conrad doesn't rise. He falls from the chair as if his very bones have dissolved. His knees strike the linoleum. He bows forward, resting his brow against Rhee's abdomen. His large, scarred hands encircle her waist, his face lost in the fabric of her dress, and then his body begins to tremble. No sound escapes him. Conrad Valetti had forgotten how to weep aloud on the night his mother passed 4 years prior. Now, his body simply weeps for him. His body is racked by huge, violent shudders, the final collapse of a retaining wall. With them comes the release of 3 years of accumulated burden, 3 years of the verdict that he was the last of his name, 3 years of rivals murmuring that his dynasty was finite, 3 years of watching shadows, contemplating a legacy turning to dust. That entire well of grief erupts on the sterile floor. His head rests against his wife's stomach, where a new heart beats 160 times per minute. A pulse the experts had declared an impossibility. Ree threads her fingers through his hair, anchoring him as her own tears fall freely. Yet she smiles through her tears, a trembling, luminous expression of one emerging from endless darkness into brilliant, shocking daylight. "Do you feel that, Conrad?" Ree whispers, her voice fractured yet steady. "Can you feel our baby?" There, on the clinic floor, Chicago's most formidable man holds fast to his wife, his silent sobs those of one recovering a misplaced part of his spirit. And the woman deemed damaged by the world simply cradles him, knowing she was never broken, for the impossible was taking root within her, silent, resilient, and utterly her own. The following spring, a year later, as cherry blossoms painted the shore and a warm wind ended Chicago's brutal winter, Ree gave birth to a healthy son in that very hospital. In the same place where 9 months earlier she had heard the words that remade her world. He weighed 3.4 kilograms, announced his arrival with a furious cry, and was flawless. As the doctor placed him on her, she gazed at his small, flushed, defiant features and wept. It was not the weeping of pain, but of absolute triumph. She held the living refutation of every cruel word ever spoken against her. His name was James Calloway Valetti. Calloway was from Ree's father, a steel worker lost in an industrial accident when she was just 11. The man had left only memories, no fortune or recompense. Now his name was bound to the Valetti legacy. Ree could almost see her father, somewhere, offering a silent nod. Conrad had remained through the entire 6-hour ordeal, his hand in hers. At the sound of his son's first cry, Chicago's most powerful man bent to kiss her brow, his voice lost to overwhelming feeling. It was only the second time Ree had seen him weep. She made a silent vow that no one would ever draw tears of sorrow from this man again. From this day forward, only joy would move him so. 2 weeks on, the atmosphere in their Lincoln Park home was transformed. His captains would have found the sight comical. Felix Valetti, the 28-year-old lieutenant whose presence terrified grown men, sat on the sofa. He held the infant with a rigid, comical exactness, his posture stiff, as if handling an unstable explosive. His expression was more concentrated than it had ever been in a standoff. Each small movement from James sent Felix glancing at Ree with pure alarm, as if this 3.4-kilogram infant posed the greatest danger he had ever faced. In a corner, Tommy stood at his easel. He was painting James asleep, a work of profound feeling and technical brilliance. Its power came not from its quality, but from its purity. For the first time in 4 years, Tommy's work contained no gloom, no shadows. There was only light, a gentle golden luminescence on the baby's face. When done, he presented it to Ree, his voice earnest. "This is yours. It is the first creation of mine that I truly love." Meanwhile, Noah's eagerness to hold James became so intense that Margaret Byrne had to create a literal timetable. Noah was allotted 30 minutes before the next in line. The 16-year-old twins, who once hid Ree's shoes and spat the word trash at her, now addressed her as Sister Ree. They claimed James as our baby, with the absolute, undiluted certainty of youth. Paige presented James with his first garment, hand-sewn from soft white cotton with delicate blue accents. The inaugural creation of a first-year design student at the Art Institute of Chicago. As Ree dressed James in it, Paige began to weep. Not from sadness, but because the last infant in a handmade outfit in this home was when her mother lived. At last, that ghost was laid to rest. Late in the night, when a deep quiet finally settled over the house, Rhys sat by the hearth in the cognac leather chair Conrad had commissioned for her. James slept on her chest, each small breath a pulse of steady warmth as the fire whispered and popped. Across the room, Conrad stood by the window, braced against the oak frame, lost in his reflections. His gaze was not on the night outside, but on the life within. Observing Rhee and the child, he saw Tommy's artwork, Paige's hand-sewn outfit, and Felix's abandoned cold coffee beside the weapon that, for the first time he could remember, he'd forgotten he was even holding. His gaze fell upon the heap of sneakers Nina and Noah had discarded in their rush to see the infant. He absorbed the entire tableau, every minor, disordered, flawed detail that hummed with vitality. In that moment, he recognized this feeling as the very thing he had surrendered all hope of finding just 3 years ago. What he had built was not an empire of power, but a sanctuary of kicked-off shoes, scented with baby formula, oil paint, and cold coffee. A family. The narrative that she was broken had always been a falsehood. She was Rhee Valetti, mother to James, the gravitational core for the 6 Valettis and the silent monarch of their domain, the woman who entered these walls with cheap shoes and a hollowed spirit and made it a home, not with wealth or force, but with an unbreakable will to endure. Down on the mansion's first floor, in a darkened study, a secret lay sealed within a 300-kilogram vault of steel known only to Conrad. Inside rested one delicate piece of evidence, nestled beside 3 pistols, 2 forged passports, and $750,000 in escape funds. It was a single, creased slip of yellowed paper, a receipt from Serafina's, dated to an October evening 1 year past. The night Conrad Valetti first witnessed a waitress stand unbowed in a den of lions. On its reverse, a single potent sentence was scrawled in Conrad's angular script. She did not yield. I have found her. Their story was never a fairy tale. This case file offers no comforting fables, no chosen saviors, no neat and happy endings. It is a chronicle etched in the acid of pure survival, of destitution, mortal peril, physical trauma, and institutional neglect. Yet it possesses what myths lack: cold, hard facts. And these facts demand a complete redefinition of what constitutes worth. They prove a person's value is not measured by their wealth or lineage, but by the courage to rise from utter ruin, the compassion offered to the marginalized, and the strength to love after a lifetime of being told you are unworthy. The subject, Rhys, began her odyssey in $12 shoes and concluded it as the head of the entire enterprise. The final reward, however, was never about control or currency. It was validation of a fundamental principle, that if you resist an immovable object with enough persistence, destiny itself will eventually concede. If this analysis resonated with you, we ask you to log your engagement, disseminate this record through your channels, and subscribe for future intelligence. We are compiling a database to correlate the subject's narrative with your own patterns of ruin and recovery. Contribute your own account below. Each entry is archived and scrutinized for themes. Our work is founded on the conviction that the apex of human existence is discovered in well-being, psychological equilibrium, and tranquility. This transmission has concluded. Please stand by for the next broadcast.
The most brutal irony in this entire story is that Rhys and Conrad are both introduced with the same hidden label: defective. She is discarded because she comes with debt. He is threatened because he cannot produce an heir. She is called damaged goods. He is treated like a dead end. Different worlds, same sentence. And that is exactly why their arc destroys people emotionally. Because fate is almost sarcastic here, the poor waitress everyone dismisses becomes the one person capable of rebuilding a criminal dynasty from the inside out. The feared boss who thinks legacy means bloodline learns that real legacy begins much earlier. It begins the moment someone turns a house back into a family. Look at how the story stacks the reversals. Reese saves Tommy before she becomes a mother. She earns Felix before she earns the council. She restores dignity to the Valetti home before she ever receives public status. By the time the baby arrives, the emotional victory has already happened. The child is not the start of the miracle, he is the confirmation of it. And then the final sting lands on the people who judge them. Grant loses Reese because he calculates human worth like an investment sheet. Jerkoff loses because he mistakes quiet intelligence for weakness. Society loses because it keeps branding people based on what they lack instead of what they endure. That is the life lesson at the core of everything. Never accept a label given to you by shallow people, fearful systems, or cruel circumstances. If Reese had believed the world's verdict, she would have disappeared. If Conrad had surrendered to his diagnosis, he would have ruled an empire and still died empty. Instead, both kept moving long enough to become living proof that the verdict was wrong.